So again, Don, thank you for that presentation.
Thank
Does
you,
anybody
Alan.
have any questions they'd like to ask or any feedback? Peter, you're muted.
It's interesting.
Do I have a, I'm sorry. I'm seeing is everyone muted?
Yeah. Can you hear me though, Don?
I can hear you.
Yeah, it looked like they were all muted. I don't know, maybe Alan.
Yeah, everyone's muted to eliminate background noise. So if you want to ask Don a question, just unmute when it's your turn.
Okay.
So, okay.
My question to Don is, or it's a comment too. It's just, those are extraordinary. It was just great to see that. What also is interesting because there's a big difference between what you're doing realistically and abstractly. But also what's interesting to me is that you use watercolor, you use gouache, you use acrylics, you use oil paint, you paint with all. So when do you decide? I mean, that because I kind of do some of that, but not to nearly the degree that you do.
Oh, really?
I think
Yeah.
that's really interesting that you use, because most oil painters don't paint in acrylic and most acrylic painters don't paint in oil, I think.
Yeah.
But so how do you decide, or what is it, just whatever is around?
That kind of is the case sometimes. I guess I'm pretty undisciplined that way, but I go in the studio most of the time not knowing what I'm going to do or what I'm going to work with, unless I have a series going. But so sometimes it'll just be, I feel like working on paper, and I'm gonna grab the watercolors. I haven't done that for a while. Those early paintings, I did a lot of watercolor early on, and mostly acrylic at that time. And then I started developing more with oil. But I think the various mediums grow up somewhat for me out of a frustration, because I have a love-hate with almost any medium I use. There's things I love about the medium, and there's things that I don't like, that I can't quite achieve, And so maybe that's why I bounce back and forth between them. I'm always looking for the perfect resolution to that medium-wise, but and I just enjoy the exploration of it. It keeps it challenging for me.
Well, thanks for sharing that. It's very makes me want to do more stuff. I think Paul has a question.
Thank you. I wanted to make a comment and ask a question about that. Don, thank you. That was fascinating to see your development, your growth, your progression, and also to hear your thought process. Some things are random, spontaneous coincidences and meetings with people. And what I noticed throughout everything was the French influence on your art. You talked about Andrew Wyeth at the beginning, but let me just point out a few connections I made with French painting. And then I want to ask if that is something that has really inspired you. So the series of the vessels really made me think of Monet, his haystacks, but also, all of the cathedral paintings and pictures of weather. And also the boulders by that lake made me think of Courbet's paintings, very solid, sort of almost structural architectural paintings of cliffs and rocks. The brush strokes, which got very, very loose, especially later on, reminded me of lots of the Impressionists. But one thing that really struck me was the vessels and vases made me think of Odilon Redon's still lifes and his paintings of vases. And also the symbolism that you talked about was very, very interesting to me. The colors really made me think of lots of the Fauve artists. And then towards the end, Gauguin and Matisse as well really came to mind, especially patches of color, particularly maybe in the branches. There's wonderful photographs you took in France and sort of elaborated. And then one last thing, definitely in some of those landscapes from your trip to France, you meant Pissarro, or Pissarro. I don't know how you say his name exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
His landscapes. But the last thing was the collage paintings and some of the earlier experiments you were making, with the you holding the fish and your father.
Mhm.
And some of the early Wyeth ones, actually, there was one of horses. The horse's legs made me think of Degas, his visits to the races. But there was one of George when you revisited later,
Mhm.
and it really made me see the influence maybe of film and editing and close-ups on your work, which reminded me of Degas' influence of photography, the influence of photography on him. And yeah, it struck me again and again and again that you must surely be very inspired by French painting and French artists. Are you? Would you mind talking a little bit about that?
Well, wow, Paul, you put me in some great company. I mean, how can I argue with that?
You belong there, I think.
But yeah, this is wonderful because that's very revealing to me, because I hadn't thought of those things in the way that you describe before in any literal way. But as a young painter, pre-Wyeth discovery, as a teenager painting, I mean, oh yeah, Monet and Pissarro and Degas, and I was enamored and studied and copied all of those artists. And yeah, the Haystack series, I mean, I saw a bunch of those a number of years ago in the Chicago Art Institute, the Haystacks of Monet in person, but I of course knew of them for many years before. And that whole concept of series maybe was something that lingered in my head without a sort of subconsciously perhaps. But and then I think for all of us, essentially as painters within the Western tradition, for instance, if you do some study of art and you're just fascinated with that tradition, it's bound to seep into your work in some form or another. The film reference, I think, is definitely, I've thought about that too, and in terms of the seriality of the images, I really am thinking of them in those terms as kind of they're a frozen narrative, but they're a moving visual narrative as well. And so the multiple images and such come out of that, I think, in a pretty direct way. Yeah, true. But thank you for those thoughts, because it helps me a lot in trying to make some kind of cohesiveness out of my own crazy sort of schizophrenic career.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for sharing. It's fascinating to see. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I have a question, more kind of like about the business side of your career. A lot of your pieces are really large. So when you set out to do a piece, do you have a gallery that's ready to take it and sell it? Or do you have to kind of try to shop it around and find a place to sell it? Or how does that part of your career work?
Wouldn't that be nice if I were that smart to have it all figured out? No, I continually am building boats in the basement, kind of, because I love to work large. And one aspect of my work that I left out of this talk is that I've also done large scale murals all over the country. And for about 16 years, most every summer I was doing that. It ties into the economics that you're talking about, because that was a way, I thought of them as large illustration projects, and there was a way to, help one end of the budget meet the other end. So they augmented our income every summer that way for quite a few years. But I think doing the mural work gave me a real thirst for large scale work. I love to work large. And so I do it in kind of in spite of myself. I don't, not all the paint, quite a few of these that I showed happen to be large. And of course, not everything I do is larger scale, but no, I rarely have any thought about what the heck am I going to do with this after I finish it. And I still deal with that, because we got large works on canvas rolled up, leaning in the studio, and never been shown anywhere except maybe a slideshow like this, because I just haven't had the circumstances for it. Career-wise, I've over the years, I've had younger artists ask me, kind of looking for a key, how did you do your career? How did you get started painting full time? And I can never give them a good answer. I can't give a good answer to people about forging a career, because it was not done methodically in my case, or with much foresight in mind. And it never has been, and it still isn't. I'm not really good, as many of us aren't. I'm not too good at self-promotion and marketing. I tend to not want to go hand in hand calling on galleries. So gallery relationships sort of happen more than they are facilitated most of the time by me. So I kind of I kind of go from pillar to post, just kind of with my fingers crossed that things are going to work out somehow. And I have to give due credit to my my dear wife, who has worked. She's retired now, but worked for many years, supporting our family, 3 kids, and helping. I couldn't have done any of this, and I couldn't have had the luxury of working full time were it not for her help as well. So it's as I'm sure we all know, the life of an artist is insecure and a roller coaster, career-wise. And sometimes I go out and make more of an effort at trying to promote myself or trying to take advantage of opportunities. But it's been a lot of luck in my part as well. From earlier on, while I was still in college, for example, one of my art profs, I had done this little Wyethie grassy landscape painting. He said, you should put that in the, I want you to put that in the Portland Art Museum's, I want you to enter it in their biennial. And I think I was 19 or maybe 20. And I'm like, well, okay, he told me to, so I entered it. And miraculously, it got in the show, and miraculously, it was purchased by a woman who happened to be the head of the Oregon Arts Commission. And then she started telling her friends, I mean, it wasn't like I did a lot of trying to build a career. It's just, and when the work started changing, and when I started losing a lot of follower collectors, gallery contacts, and so forth, I really had to I don't want to make this sound grandiose, but I had to sort of sit down and reassess, how far am I willing to bend to, should I keep doing what I'm doing that's popular, or keep going down this path? And I had to go back to when I was like 6 years old and drawing obsessively and think, well, did I start this because I wanted a career as an artist? I did it out of some kind of impulse or obsession. And I realized that you kind of have to forge ahead with whatever you're doing and try to stay true to your own heart or direction. And in my case, I've been very fortunate that way. And I have nothing but the highest respect for so many artists who have not, have to find extra time at night or on the weekends from their regular jobs. I don't honestly know how they all do it and do such wonderful work, but I've been very fortunate.
I also want to make a comment. I really appreciated how you always seem to use elements from your life. It's almost like a narrative of your life, or you did mention a visual diary. And so I think of the work I do, whenever I try to put myself in my work, it just is like, who'd want to see this? So I appreciate the connection you have between your personal life and your artwork. I mean, I think it's really making me rethink about my work and the way I approach it. And for what it's worth, I find, especially in the pictures and the paintings where you integrate photos of your past and memory type of things, I find those to be very wistful. And particularly that experience that you said about being in the house and meeting George, and then that picture of George at the window. I mean, that's one picture I'll remember for a long time. I mean, it just has such a wistful feeling to it. So I really appreciate that aspect of your work.
Well, that's wonderful to hear, Alan. I greatly appreciate that. Thank you.
Does anybody else have a question for Don or a comment? Yeah, Lauren, go ahead. You're muted, Lauren.
Okay, how's that?
There you are.
Good. Don, apart from photos actually appearing in your paintings, I'm curious to what extent you utilize photographs in the depictions of more realistic or even less realistic settings.
Yeah. I do use photographs when I'm doing realistic work or some element of representation. I'll access photographs that I take. Early on, I used to do a lot more drawing. I draw, and I guess it was coming out of that Wyeth model that, you're supposed to just do study after study for a painting. And I did that. I worked for a long time more from drawing. Over the years, that's kind of morphed into more with photos. And so I use photos kind of like trying to hold them at arm's length all the time. I like photos that are not, if I print one out on the computer, I like it if it's not very well printed, if it doesn't look that good. I like to distance myself from the photo image as much as possible to try to get as much of myself into the image as I can, but I do use them. Yeah.
Yeah, because I would think, especially with those early paintings that you showed, where the amount of detail of stones and plant life in the foreground, like how rich visually that was, and whether one could sit in that environment and sort of address it stone by stone, blade of grass by blade of grass, or where the photograph, in fact, simplifies that to some extent.
Yeah, well, the early stuff, a lot of that was plein air kind of work, like watercolors on location and things. And I don't do that too much anymore. It's much more studio oriented, but yeah.
And another question relating to that is, and I think maybe what triggers this to some extent, when you were talking about going somewhere and coming back and then looking at the picture and the disappointment because the moment maybe was so charged in real life, and the photographic depiction is so banal in comparison. But I'm curious how you relate to space as opposed to the camera relating to space. If you are plein air, for example, do you perceive space in the same way that, let's say, your 35 millimeter lens or your 50 millimeter lens or your 180 millimeter, I don't know to what degree you are conscious of that component of it, but just your basic communication with space and how it resonates on your retina and
Mhm.
versus the camera space.
Yeah, Lauren, I think I think you really hit the nail on the head with that, because that's probably right at the heart of why, at least for me, a photograph that I take disappoints, because when you're in an environment, you're in a 360 environment, you're in this world, you snap a photo, you just chipped off a little piece of that real world that you exist in, and spatially you flattened it out, of course, initially with the photo itself. And so that's inevitably going to be something different. But also, it's just the fact that it just didn't, it didn't catch the smell, it didn't catch the feel in the air, it doesn't have the particular feel of that sunlight on the side of your face, that, all those things that you're experiencing in the real and in the now, that a photo becomes a souvenir of. And I'm always concerned, or I especially was concerned about losing that feeling of the now when I'm working from photos, when I was working representationally, because the photo would start supplanting my memory. It sort of overwhelmed what I was remembered. I don't think about it that much anymore. And when I do work with photos these days, it's just much more loosely thought about, and I'm not after the same goals. So it doesn't concern me that way now.
Yeah, photographs are hugely reductivist. And,
Right.
and as you said, the feeling of the sun on your face, the smell of the ocean, all those things do not convey through the lens
Mhm.
in quite the same way. And my background is as a photographer,
Mhm.
and what the camera challenges me to do is to load the image up with a kind of charge that can lead the imagination down these other sensory roads. And I've been thinking about it lately as kind of a surface tension. The same thing that we learned in science about what exists on the top of a glass of water, and
Mhm.
that you could drop a piece of dust and it won't sink to the bottom. It'll sit on this surface tension. So a lot of my photographs, I'm if I can charge that surface tension with enough kind of explosive power, then in fact it goes beyond the eye and starts to work towards these other senses or memories or experiences that aren't necessarily contained on that particular beach, but maybe are contained in our memories or
Mhm.
our collective unconscious that we somehow tap into.
Yeah.
And
So how do you go about that, Lauren? Is it in selection with the photograph, or is it manipulation after the fact? You're manipulating the image.
no, I don't manipulate, or I manipulate as little as possible. I stay very true to the cropping that I
Mhm.
saw through the lens. That was my training, in the same way that perhaps Wyeth and the drawing sensibility was your training, was that you're presented with a rectangle.
Mhm.
And my mentor told me, he said, everybody's eyes are different, not physiologically different, but in a sense, our seeing is different.
Mhm.
And that what we have to do as artists is get to our own way of seeing and sort of load that up with everything we have.
Mhm.
And so my way of seeing, I've come to realize, is kind of awkward. I don't have an elegant sense of design, but I have a kind of clunkiness, almost like Doc Marten boots or something like that. And so I've just accepted that. And the more clunky I allow myself to be, then in a sense, the more I'm speaking my own heartfelt language. That's an oversimplification, but
No, that's fascinating. And, you know, and that's the point where we all need to kind of face, if we don't want to be, is that we're all unique, and we, you know, why are we pursuing this if we're constantly being over influenced or trying to follow somebody else's concept of how you should be or who you should be. You got to be yourself, and that's the authenticity of the art search, of course.
Yeah,
That's
yeah. And I think it took me a good 15 to 20 years to sort of put all these
me too.
fashions and styles and heroes and mentors,
Hmm.
you know, the Cartier-Bressons and the Lee Friedlanders and all, Robert Frank, all these people who are
Hmm.
elemental in my development, and say, yes, I've lived a little Frank, I've lived a little this, but I can't just be copies. I have to find my own voice. And it took me, you know, very far away from where I actually thought I wanted to be. But like yourself, you go out on a limb for a while, and then you come back to the center,
Yeah.
and you wonder if that limb sort of is supporting something new, or whether it was just a kind of thing that you had to do for whatever
Yeah.
reason.
Yeah.
It's curious looking back and making those connections in one's own narrative of one's work.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I don't know. I look back, I like you. I mean, you know, you sort of, you don't exactly kill off your influences, but you absorb them. And I still, you know, I'll go online, I look at artists, go, man, I love that. I want to do something like that. I even sometimes will print out an image of somebody else's work, pin it up on the wall and say, that's inspiring me. I want to do something like, and I paint away and I'm thinking, well, yeah, I'm really doing something like, then I step back and I go, well, it doesn't look like that at all. I can't even try to do it that way. You know, at a certain point, you just are yourself, I think, and you'll have these influences, but you're not copying them anymore. You know, you can't do it even. So,
I heard Bob Dylan in an interview talk about the songs he wrote in the 60s. He said, I can't write like that anymore.
exactly. Yeah, you know, you can look back on your work, and there's periods in my work that go, geez, I would love to do some more of that, but it's the same as somebody else pinning it on the wall. You know, it's you can't step in the same river twice, that kind of thing. We live our lives, everything's in motion and changing, and a lot of times we tend to want to think of ourselves as being these stable beings within this, you know, malleable world that we live in. And so we're not. So we have to be what we are in the moment.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions for Don? Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Don. Thank you for your sharing and your eloquence.
My pleasure.
It was really a spectacular journey to see you go from phase to phase in your work, and also just the discoveries that you made in each phase, and how the quality of it and the depth, the impact in each phase is just something. I've not seen that quite before, and especially from someone who came from such a traditional background,
Right.
that you were able to allow yourself to make these kinds of transitions. But you know, the color is spectacular, the forms, just beautiful work. I'm still curious about these transitions, what it was like for you, you know, to move from more of a Wyeth centered, Corot centered painting into
Yeah.
the bottles, and then from the bottles to the broken pot, and then how you kind of move from one thing to the other. It's a fascinating transition. So I just would like to hear a little bit more about how that was for you between those transitions when you maybe felt most vulnerable.
Vulnerable's the right word. It really, I did feel very vulnerable, and I still can, and I think that's that's common for creative people. And anytime you put your foot somewhere you don't know, you're going to increase your sense of vulnerability. Maybe I'm making a mistake. Maybe I'm in the wrong direction. For me, early on, when I started developing, when the ideas started growing in my head to change, it was very exciting, and I was enthusiastic about it. It was nervous, I suppose, but I was also so thirsty to explore, and enjoy that. And I really was naive about it in terms of how other people were going to interpret this. I had a woman come up to my studio, as a matter of fact, case in point, who had purchased work of mine in the past. And when she came up to the studio, I had some large pieces going, very abstracted kind of pieces, very different. She got red-faced angry with me. She dressed me down. So like, you have an obligation to your collectors and blah, blah, like that. And it really set me on my heels at the time. And I was polite to her, and I think the main reason I was so polite to her was that it was a vulnerable time. I didn't know for sure what I'm doing or what, where I'm going with the work. I was excited about it, but it's very vulnerable to put yourself out there like that, and even to yourself, And so when she laid into me, I was kind of polite. If she were to do that now, I'd boot her down the stairway. I wouldn't countenance that now. I think I've learned something over the time about that process. But yeah, it's those in between times and the dead times when you're like, well, where do I go now? They can be, pull our hair out. We all know those experiences, and it's just showing up. I've just learned, the old adage, you just show up, you just go to work, whether you feel like it or not. You just try to put yourself in the moment and move ahead somehow. But they're not orchestrated moves ever for me. That just sort of feel random. I can look back and make more sense out of what I was doing than I do in the moment. Is that answering at all?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
We've got about 5 minutes left. Does anybody have one more question they'd like to ask Don? Or comment?
I have one last question for Don. In terms of I noticed a lot of times you mentioned that you have canvas and you roll them up. Do you do a lot of that? I mean, it's kind of a workman's question though, because on the back of your studio wall, and then do you have stretch them, or how often do you have stretch canvas and then work from that way?
Yeah, if they're going to end up in a show somewhere somehow, then I build a stretcher frame and put them on the stretcher, and and then it's another problem to deal with. If the piece doesn't show. Now I've, instead of a rolled up canvas, I've got a great big canvas on a stretcher, and so am I going to break that down and put it back in a roll or not? So it's a logistical issue, the storage issue. I don't know. I think even the most successful artists probably don't sell during their lifetime, at least, probably create much more work than they sell, just out of the nature of it. If you're reasonably prolific, you just do a lot of work, and then it becomes an issue. Where are you going to put it? And as was said earlier, if I were wiser about the larger scale, I suppose a reasonable man would just not do those unless you had a venue to put them in, and a reasonable prospect of selling them in the first place. But I just continue on my batting windmills.
Can I just briefly say about how eloquent you are, Don? I really love the way you articulate your thoughts and feelings. That's one thing that's particularly impressed me today. Thank you for your eloquence.
Oh,
You
my.
away with words as well as with a brush.
Well, that's greatly appreciated, Paul. Thank you. I don't think of myself that way at all. I'm usually kind of fumbling for words, but
You find the right ones.
appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, Don, I want to thank you once again, and I'd like to thank everybody for joining us.
Yeah.
We're developing a nice little library of art talks, and this is a great addition to it. So,
Yep. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And thanks everyone for coming. And I appreciate your taking time out of this busy holiday season to sit with us for a while. And so I'm very honored by it. And thank you, Peter and Alan, very much for doing this.
you're welcome.
Happy
Thanks for doing
holidays, everyone.
Thank you, Don. That was fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.